Hello, my name is Lisette and I will be leading the Sprint 3 meeting minutes video for the project Exploring the Unconscious. Our product owner for the project is Dr. Mario Eraso and our mentor is Dr. Masoud. For Sprint 3, we primarily focused on design. So for our first meeting, Tom had already completed the first design, as well as myself, and we were both determined to complete the second design by the following meeting because we were going to have a meeting with Mario and wanted to get his input. Tom had a hurdle which was finding his inner artist, and my hurdle was managing my time. For our second meeting, we had already met with Mario to go over our progress and the application's design. And we had also created the second design as well as a design with each other. So we planned on working on the final design for the next Scrum meeting. Both of us were having trouble with finding our inner artist though. For the third meeting, Tom and I had already created the final design, and we planned on having Tom work on adding the chimes and music, and for myself to work on integrating the design that we had created into the application. Neither one of us had hurdles at this point. For the fourth meeting, Tom had already worked on adding the sounds and a chime to the application. He also added the foundation for adding music. And by the next meeting, he had planned on having worked on adding the chime to every button. His hurdle though was finding the right music as well as finding a recorded voice for when we added the voice. I had, on the other hand, created the documentation for all of the previously created designs that I had made and put them on Confluence, as well as finished the final design and sent it to Mario, and created the documentation for the final design and added it to Confluence for future references. I planned on continuing to work on integrating the design into the application and had no hurdles to this point. By that Friday, Com had added the new home buttons and was adding chimes to every single button. And he planned on having worked on adding the sound preference set page for the next Scrum meeting. His current hurdle at the moment was getting familiar with Android Studio's preference class. I had worked on integrating the design and had changed all of the backgrounds and started formatting the pages. I planned on continuing to work on the integrating of the design into the application, and my hurdle in the moment was working with Android Studio's equivalent of CSS, something I would continuously struggle with through the remainder of the sprint. By Monday, Com had continued working on the preference page and planned to continue doing the same thing by the next meeting. His hurdle was time management. I had worked on integrating the design at this point and planned on continuing to do so. I was still having trouble working with Android Studio's equivalent of CSS, and I was also having trouble managing my time. Something we both hadn't anticipated during this week and this sprint was our midterms. So during meeting 7, Com had already continued to work on the preference page and was learning the basics of fragments to use on the preference page. He planned to continue learning how to use fragments for the following meeting. His primary hurdle was not knowing fragments, which hindered the process of implementing the preference class and managing his time, because at this point we both realized we had midterms that week. I had worked on integrating the design and planned on continuing to integrate the design into the application and fix all of the buttons to go with the design and add the back buttons to all of the pages, something we hadn't previously foreseen. And my hurdle was still working with Android Studio's equivalent of CSS, and like Khan, I had midterms and was having trouble managing my time. For meeting 8, Khan had already continued working on the preference page and had a preference settings page in existence where you can choose between the options. So what he planned to have done by the next meeting was applying the user-chosen preferences to the application. And again, his hurdle was time. I had worked on integrating the design and had already added the font that we had chose in our design to the application, and I had worked on styling the buttons. I planned on continuing to integrate the design into the application by the next meeting and add the back buttons to all of the pages. My hurdle was still working with essentially Android's version of CSS and managing the time. For meeting 9, Com had completed the preferences page and completed adding the music and chimes. He planned to work on adding a voice placeholder and was also having trouble managing his time. I had worked on integrating the design and I planned to continue to do the integration and add the back buttons to all of the pages. My hurdle was still using Android Studio's equivalent of CSS to center the buttons and managing my time. For our last meeting, Com was still working on the voice placeholder and he planned to continue doing so throughout the weekend. His hurdle at the time was the voice was playing double and he was still having a hard time managing his time, and I had already added the back buttons by then, and I was trying to fix the back button styling because the buttons wouldn't center properly on the page. And my next plan was to also merge the design code with the music code, which meant having to sit down and figure out what was added on the music code that was touching the design code. And my hurdle was still working with the CSS and managing my time. If you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and contact us. Our emails are on the screen.